pleasure to introduce you to the new 40 acres and its skirts National Register Historic District. This district stretches across Norwottuck homeland. This land was relied on by Pocumtuck, Nonotuck, Mohawk, Nipmuc, and Mohican people who were dispossessed when European families like the Porters came to have it in the 17th century. The museum recognizes the responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession alongside enslavement that generated the wealth reflected in this historic property. Using collections, interpretation, programs, and through collaborative relationships, the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum is working to examine, address, and reflect on these difficult but necessary histories. Today's program introduces one of the most important of these efforts, a public national affirmation of the historic significance of this property, and a nomination document whose new and synthesizing research will ground our understanding of this place for decades to come. The nomination documents for the new historic district now detail the site's significant association with agricultural history, which was not listed as one of its categories when this site was first created. Women's history, also not listed. Black and African American history, also not listed. Indigenous history, also not listed. Architectural history, which was listed, and pastkeeping in the Connecticut River Valley. The revision of this nomination documentation is in itself a powerful example of pastkeeping, of the ways in which how we understand the past changes over time. The new tours now offered at the museum were spurred and anchored in this research and in related research undertaken with support of grants from Mass Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. If you haven't taken one of our new tours, I urge you to come back and take one. I also urge you to sign the guest book in the back so that if you give us your email, you'll get announcements about all the things going on here. I also want to urge you to join us on Saturday, September 23rd, when the museum will be holding an installation ceremony installing 6 commemorative markers for the 6 people enslaved on this site: Zebulon Truck, Caesar Phelps, Margaret Head Bowen, and her daughters, Rosanna and Phyllis, and her granddaughter, Phyllis. Increasing our understanding of their lives and the many ways that the affluence of this farmstead and the Phelps Farm property across the street was supported by enslaved labor is now central to the inclusion of this property on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register, often called the nation's official list of buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts worthy of preservation, that's a quote, was established in 1966. The Porter-Phelps-Huntington House was nominated for the National Register in 1973. The properties listed in the National Register are weighed heavily towards white history. The National Park Service's Underrepresented Communities Grant program is one of several federal programs established in recent years designed to redress this imbalance in what is considered significant in the history of our nation. The purpose of this program is to diversify the National Register by creating new nominations that reflect the real diversity of the nation's history, and by updating existing nominations to include the histories of underrepresented groups associated with properties but left out of earlier documentation. In 2019, the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Museum collaborated with the Massachusetts Historical Commission to apply for a National Park Services Underrepresented Community Grant to do both of these things: radically revising and expanding the information about the site reported in the initial nomination, and providing historic preservation recognition to the surrounding agricultural fields, to Phelps Farm, and to Kestrel's Elizabeth Huntington Dyer Field and Forest Conservation Area. That is, to 114 acres that had not been part of the earlier National Historic District. Wonderfully, in 2020, the Massachusetts Historical Commission was awarded one of only 18 grants nationwide to undertake this nomination revision. Liz Scott, who owns Phelps Farm, actively supported the research with her memories of the place and the donation of vast quantities of papers still kept in the 1816 farmhouse. In 2022, she generously donated Phelps Farm itself to the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation. Thank you, Liz.
Yay!
The Massachusetts Historical Commission selected Marla R, Professor of History and Public History at the University of Massachusetts, and Brian Whetstone, at the time a PhD candidate at UMass, to research and write the nomination. How lucky we have been to have such talented scholars and wonderful people take on this project. So now let me introduce Brian Whetstone, to let him tell you about this process and about some of the surprising and fascinating stories the nomination process recovered. Brian Whetstone is a public historian and historian of late 20th century U.S. urban history. He holds a PhD in history and a certificate in public history from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Before coming to Massachusetts for his graduate work, Brian served as a leading or contributing author of 4 other National Register of Historic Places nominations in the states of Nebraska and Iowa and in Washington, D.C., and was the leading author of 2 applications for the City of Omaha's Landmark Heritage Preservation Commission's Local Landmarks Program. Brian has worked with the National Park Service's Northeast Regional Office to commemorate the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment, with Restoration Exchange Omaha to promote historic preservation in Omaha, Nebraska's metro area, and with the Humanities Action Lab to develop an exhibit on climate justice in Springfield, Massachusetts. In addition to his work on the 40 acres and its skirts historic district, Brian serves on the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Board Committee, working to preserve the main house at Phelps Farm, and undertook tour design, guide training, and support for the museum this summer. He has brought so much creativity, curiosity, skill, and pragmatic just roll up your sleeves and do it glee to every aspect of his work with the foundation. It's been such a joy to ask questions, solve problems, sort papers, even fill dumpsters with Brian. Dr. Whetstone's dissertation examines the development of the historic preservation movement in Springfield, Massachusetts, and is now the root of his book project, To Bring the Inner City Back to Life, Historic Preservation's Urban Politics, 1966 to 1986. That project has been recognized by the Princeton Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities. And a few days from now, Brian heads off to New Jersey as a Princeton Mellon postdoctoral fellow. Please join me in welcoming, thank you,
by the National Park Service, which is housed within the Department of the Interior, and it was officially created in 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act, which remains the guiding piece of policy and legislation directing preservation here in the United States. So nationally, nearly 100,000 properties are listed in the National Register, and I have this map shown here that actually shows the percentage of those that are here in Hadley already. You may or may not be familiar with the fact that Hadley, prior to the creation and expansion of this historic district this year, already had 3 National Register historic districts. And that was the Hadley Center Historic District, which is the really large blob in the middle of all of this. That was first created in the 70s and then later expanded in the 1990s. There's the Hockanum Historic District, which is down in the little sliver there in the left-hand corner, which is Hadley's smallest historic district in terms of the number of properties that are included in it. And then the North Hadley Historic District there near the top of the map. Our new historic district is between the Hadley Center and the North Hadley, which you can kind of see by the dashed line here in that photo. So it's very possible you may live in Hadley, and you may in fact live in a historic district here and might not even know it. And part of that is because the National Register is purely honorific. To be listed and to be designated in it does not require any kind of onus on a property owner to do anything with their property that they might have otherwise done already. So you could tear something down that is on the National Register of Historic Places, and that happens all the time. It's actually quite common. The only restrictions is on the federal government, really. So if there's a government-funded project that would impact your property and it's listed on the National Register, that would require some kind of review process to stop it. But then it also opens up these incentives for different structures. such as historic tax credits. Here, as a nonprofit institution, the museum is eligible for different grants because of its listing on the National Register. So there are more advantages than disadvantages to being designated on the National Register of Historic Places. And I'm happy to talk about the issues that come into play in other communities where you have to get permission to do certain things for a structure. That does not exist here in Hadley, for better or for worse. So how do you qualify to be designated on the National Register? You have to be historically significant in some way, and then your structure has to have enough of what's called integrity to demonstrate your significance. So Porter-Phelps-Huntington, for example, when it was first listed in the 1970s, had colonial settlements and architecture. And the National Park Service at that time determined that the structure was intact enough to explain that piece of its significance. But there are all these various criterion that you can use to guide the way that you determine why something is particularly significant. So you can be associated with certain historic events or broad historical trends. You can be associated with a specific famous person, like a president is often very common to designate under this criteria. You can be significant purely for being architecturally important or architecturally significant. And then there's kind of an archaeological category of significance, which is, can the property yield some kind of archaeological evidence that's important for us to know? So you can also be designated at the local, state, and national level for your significance. There's kind of a sliding scale here in terms of how significant you are actually determined to be by the National Park Service. And there's a multi-part review process that goes into this as well. So a state board reviews the initial National Register nomination. It's then picked up to the National Park Service, who gives the final kind of stamp of approval. So this can take multiple years. So Karen mentioned that the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation got this grant in 2019. The new historic district was not officially designated in the National Register until May of 2023. So you can see that over 4 years, this project really took shape, and that's actually quite typical for a lot of these projects. It can take a very, very long time for something like this to happen, which is why it's so exciting that it has happened here. So these are some of the areas that you can qualify for under significance. And as Karen mentioned, there are only 2 out of this entire list that our original nomination here in 1973 included. And that was architecture, which you can see listed up there. And the second one was a category that they made up, which was colonial settlement was one of the, and they listed that under an other category to make that happen. So the other complicating factor in this house's original nomination in 1973 is that it didn't actually include the entire house. Because of the way that the property had been divided, in order to give this house to the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation from members of the Huntington family, they actually cut the property line through the back wall here. The wall behind me was the legal boundary of this property when it was first listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So anything beyond this wall was not technically considered part of the original nomination. Another factor that led to the nomination needing updated was there was only one source that was cited to elaborate on the house's history. And that was James Lincoln Huntington's 1949 book, 40 Acres. That is the only citation in its entire nomination, which is about 1 paragraph long. So the new nomination by comparison is around 200 pages. So that tells you how much we have actually expanded this. So this is the boundary now of the new historic district, which you can see includes portions of all of 40 acres, the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation here across the street, and several landscape features and buildings that we'll be visiting today. And then it also encompasses the entire complex across the street known as Phelps Farm, which includes 3 houses, 5 to 7 agricultural buildings, several other landscape features, and a potential archaeological site. So that was really important for us to include as part of this nomination. And as Karen mentioned, the new district is about 114 acres large. So it's encompassing a lot of active agricultural land, which is an important part of these sites' histories that was largely excluded from their original nomination. The other thing that it includes now is all these expanded categories of significance, which reflects the ways that our understanding of these sites have changed over time. And so what's really important about this effort to expand our National Historic District representation is that most National Register nominations are never updated. In fact, it's somewhere around like 2 to 3% are ever updated or seriously revised or revisited again. And National Register nominations are a really important port of entry for people trying to learn about a site. If you've ever Googled a historic site and you've read its Wikipedia page, that Wikipedia page was probably pulled from a National Register of Historic Places nomination. So these might not seem like the most public documents because they're somewhat technical, but they filter out into the world in kind of unexpected and uncontrollable ways. So it's important that we have all this expanded representation in this district that reflects the new scholarship that's been done here for the last half century or so. It also includes a new period of significance, which ranges from the mid-18th century in 1752, when this house at 40 acres was first constructed, all the way to the late 1970s, when the dairy herd across the street at Phelps Farm was sold. So we have a really long period of significance here as well, which encompasses all these stories that have been more or less overlooked. So I want to, since we can't go across the street to Phelps Farm, I just want to very briefly tell you like what is there and why it's important, and then we're going to get on our feet and move around 40 acres and take a look at some of the exciting things that got to be included in the historic district over here. So as you can see, Phelps Farm is this really large complex. The main farmhouse is down there at the bottom, which was constructed first in 1816 and then elaborated on through a series of additions in the 1820s. There's a manager's house that was built for a farm manager at the turn of the century, an extensive agricultural outbuilding complex, and then another separate house and series of agricultural outbuildings just to the north of it. So there's a lot going on here at Phelps Farm, architecturally and historically. So one of the new areas that was expanded upon was that of architecture, and the house at Phelps Farm is architecturally significant, in part because of its association with Asher Benjamin, who some of you may already be familiar with. He was an architect here in the Connecticut River Valley that published a series of pattern books at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century that was supposed to kind of inform housewrights and carpenters how to add particular design elements. So there are several components to the farmhouse across the street at Phelps Farm that are direct matches for some Asher Benjamin patterns that he published. So you can see the cornice on the house matches the design for a cornice in one of his pattern books. There's a fireplace in one of his pattern books that's a direct match inside the house too. So we don't know if Asher Benjamin designed this house, but this tells us that Phelps and the people who built this house were familiar with Benjamin, and that this was one of the ways that his work was kind of distributed throughout the Connecticut River Valley during this period. Another important connection are Black history stories that are associated with the site. And one of the really exciting discoveries that Karen alluded to was these receipt bundles that were stowed away in the attic of the farmhouse and were kind of uncovered in this really exciting discovery a couple of years ago. And Charles Porter-Phelps, before he built the house in 1816, worked as a merchant in Boston from 1799 to around 1816 when he moved back here to Hadley. And these receipt bundles document his activities as a merchant while he was living in Boston, directing ships from Caribbean ports to European ports and trading in goods like sugar, indigo, rice, cotton, tobacco. All of these commodities that we know were likely produced and created by enslaved labor. So this was a way for us to think of the house not as a direct site of enslavement, but having these ties to enslavement in other parts of the Atlantic world, and was dependent on enslavement to be created in the first place. We know after the house is built, it's also the site of free Black labor, particularly from the Till family, William and Lucinda. from the 1810s through the 1840s and 50s, Lucinda and William Till pop up all throughout the historical record. They're whitewashing rooms in the house, they're putting up wallpaper, they're tending the kitchen garden to the east of the house, they are making soap and candles for the family and doing laundry. So this is a really important site to think about those histories at Phelps Farm. And we have a similar story here across the street with both an enslaved and free Black community of workers. Another important story, of course, is agriculture and women's history, which are very much linked across the street. In the late 19th century, the house was acquired by the Huntington family of the same Porter-Phelps-Huntington lineage over here. And it was Ruth Huntington Sessions who turns the house into one of Hadley's most successful and profitable dairy farms here in Hadley. It was by the 1930s had 55 head of cattle, which was one of the largest farms here at that time. And it was later Ruth's daughter-in-law, Donnie Sessions, who some of you may be familiar with or might have known, who ran the dairy after her husband John's death and after her mother-in-law's Ruth's death. So there's a really critical women's history story that's reflected across the street, as well as this wonderful agricultural history story about the production and changes in production of the dairy industry here in Western Massachusetts. So we know, for example, that the farm was one of the first to infuse the milk with vitamin D, which they did from the 1930s through the 1950s, which was kind of to promote the health value of the milk and the nutritional value of the milk. And so you can see here from this top photo, which is like a cardstock banner that came out of the house. This was another one of the archival discoveries. There's this patriotic spin to it, that the V for victory, it's V for vitamins, and they're doing this during World War II, which I think is really fun. And you can see from the photo on the bottom, the kind of outbuilding complex with the cows laying in the field as well. So from the 1890s, really through the 1970s, this was one of Hadley's most successful and largest dairy operations. And the fact that the cattle herd was sold in the 1970s tells us also about how the dairy industry shifted here in Western Massachusetts to make it more profitable to have a larger and larger farm operation, so that by the time you get to the 1960s and 70s, 55 head of cattle was nothing, right? Now you need tons and tons of cattle, and Phelps Farm did not make that transition in the same way that some other farms did. So that, again, tells us something about agricultural history here in the valley. So now I want us to transition to 40 acres, and this will be the more public walking component of the tour, so we can actually see some of the contributing structures and resources that make up our little portion of the historic district over here across the street. So this is our map of 40 acres. You can see that there are about 7 different resources here across the street that are considered contributing resources to the overall historic district. So that includes the main house here, which stretches from the original 1752 portion all the way to where we are currently sitting, with the corn barn that was originally built here in 1797 and reconstructed, to the Shays house, which is attached to these buildings, the garage, the driveway. There's a large berm in the back of the house, and then 2 gardens, the north garden and the south garden. So those are all of the various resources that we have over here. And the stories that we have a particular strength in at this site are those of pastkeeping. And if you want to pass this slide. So pastkeeping is what Marla and I defined as this wide-ranging, ever-changing activities through which people convey their understanding of the past and give shape to its time and passage. So on the landscape here, we certainly have the house to tell a lot of those 18th century stories, but we actually have, I think, a distinct advantage here at 40 acres in telling some of the 20th century history stories here across the street, when our museum's founder, James Lincoln Huntington, turned this house into a museum really over the course of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to the establishment of the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation here in 1955. Huntington made a lot of really dramatic changes that tell us about how local elites in New England understood their past and then enacted that understanding on the landscape around them to shape the way that people would also understand and interpret the past going forward. So you'll notice here, this is the space we're currently sitting in is a great example of that. You'll notice here in this picture that the corn barn that we're currently in is missing because James Lincoln Huntington tore it down in 1928. So what we are currently sitting in is not a 1797 structure, we're here in a 1920s structure, which if you look up and around you, right, you can see that this is a pretty standard balloon frame structure. You can see the original 1797 framing on the wall behind you. So you can see how he attached this structure to that original framing. But this is a 1920s structure, right? He kind of built it along the same architectural lines as the original, but it is not the original. And it is not serving its original purpose of storage for like hay and silage and farm equipment, right? It's now this space where we're talking about our understanding of the past, right? It has this more pastoral, passive use rather than an active agricultural use to it as well. So that ends the part where I'm just like talking at you and we're sitting in a hot room portion of this. We are going to transition into walking the grounds here and talking about some of the various resources present on the landscape. So if you are able to join us, I would ask that we kind of step outside. You don't have to join us at that time. Are there any questions before we make that transition?
You had mentioned to be on the register at different levels.
Yes.
State, national, whatever. What level is that designation?
So this is considered a locally significant designation. Good question.
Yeah.
The fields are still used for agricultural purposes, but the farm building is not. All right, I'll meet you outside, just right after.